Hello, welcome to Naresh Technologies. This is Sudhakar Sharma. In today's session, we are going to discuss about what is ADO.NET Entity Framework. Already the people who are aware of ADO.NET in .NET Framework. This is one of the important concept to know about what is ADO.NET Entity Framework. As it is very much trending these days, everywhere people are looking for entity framework. All advanced technologies are using ADO.NET Entity Framework in Microsoft. So, that is the reason why we should know what exactly Entity Framework is. In the complete session of Entity Framework, we will see the practical approach of communicating with the database by using ADO.NET Entity Framework. But first we will have an overview of what exactly ADO.NET Entity Framework is. The basic architecture of ADO.NET Entity Framework. In order to go into the concept of ADO.NET Entity Framework, first I have to give a basic outline of your general data accessing frameworks in .NET. As already you know that in order to establish communication and handle communication between application and database, we have a framework introduced by Microsoft. Earlier we used ADO, after that on .NET framework we used ADO.NET, and from the .NET framework version 3.5 they introduced ADO.NET Entity Framework. So, what exactly ADO.NET Entity Framework is and what are the key features of ADO.NET Entity Framework? Let us have an outline on that. Entity Framework is actually an ORM. ORM means Object Relational Mapper. What is the concept of ORM is earlier in your ADO.NET, generally .NET developers need to write everything for database. In order to interact with the database, they need to query with the database. Now, ORM is a concept. It is an object relational mapper where .NET developers will write for the business requirements. That means Entity Framework is an object relational mapper where .NET developers can interact with the database by communicating with the help of business specific logic. That means developers will no longer write for database, they will write for the business requirements. One of the main advantage of that is no longer developers need to be having a database in order to build the application. They will design everything for the business requirement, and when database is ready, this application will interact with the database. So, what exactly Entity Framework is? Entity Framework is an object relational mapper that enables .NET developers to work with relational data by using domain specific classes. We call these domain specific objects as POCO, plain old CLR objects. It eliminates the need of most of the data access code that usually developers need to write. So, one of the key advantages of this. So, when we talk about ADO.NET Entity Framework, what is the major advantage of ADO.NET Entity Framework? The implementation of ORM with the Entity Framework provides several services like lazy loading, change tracking, identity resolution, and query translation. Some of the key features of ADO.NET Entity Framework are change tracking, identity resolution, lazy loading, and query translations. I will give you just a basic example of what is lazy loading. Later in other sessions, when we are continuing with Entity Framework, we will discuss about other features. In general real world requirement, if you got a requirement where you have millions of records in the database, Due to those millions of records, you need to access all those millions of records and show in a UI. You may be using your grid view to display the data. When you are displaying the data by using a grid view, you have to pull all the million records and show in the grid view in multiple pages. Generally what happens is we try to access all the million records and put them into 100 pages. Instead of that, we can implement lazy loading. Lazy loading is a concept where object is initialized only when it is required. That means when you are watching the first page, it will get only the first page records and show in the grid view. When user switches to the second page, then only the second page will be loaded. That means the next set of records are pulled from the database. So unnecessarily all the records are not pulled from the database and loaded into your grid view. They are loaded only when you are switching to the next pages. This improves the performance of application. Generally in ADO.NET, we need to implement this as a special option when we are working with databases. But ADO.NET Entity Framework provides as a built-in feature for lazy loading. So some key features of ADO.NET Entity Framework are lazy loading, change tracking, query translation, and object materialization. So one of the main advantage of that is developers can focus on their application specific business logic. That means earlier developers need to focus on database logic. Now developers need not to focus on database logic, they will focus on application specific business logic rather than the database fundamentals. The key advantage is they need not to be database ready in order to build an application. We build application and whenever database ready, it can interact with the database. That is what the key concept of ADO.NET Entity Framework. ADO.NET Entity Framework has a full provider model. It provides communication not only with SQL Server, but also databases like Oracle, MySQL and DB2. That means you can use ADO.NET Entity Framework not only with SQL Server, you can use it with Oracle or MySQL or DB2 also. So it has a full provider model that can communicate with various databases. And one of the great feature of ADO.NET Entity Framework is Entity Framework introduces multiple modeling techniques. What are these multiple modeling techniques? It introduces the modeling techniques like we have the code first, we have the model first and the database first. So Entity Framework has full provider model to communicate with various databases, and Entity Framework introduces multiple modeling techniques like code first, model first or database first. What are these modeling techniques? Let us take a look about these three. So when you look at the modeling techniques, suppose you are building application for real time. When you are building application, think if database is not ready for your application and you need to build the application. In that situation, so when we start and we design our domain specific classes, we are designing our domain specific classes because there is no database ready yet. That means we are no longer writing for database, we are writing for the business requirements. For the business requirement, you design your classes, and these classes will be responsible for mapping with the database tables. That means for your classes, whenever database is ready, it can communicate with it. That means database is not ready first, the business logic is ready. You return the logic to interact with the database, you return the classes that are representing your business, and those classes will create the database. This type of approach is called as code first. In code first approach, we will first design the classes, and these classes will map to database tables. So whenever database tables are ready, then these classes will be responsible for interacting with them. This type of approach is code first approach. If you do not have domain classes and you have database, means in your project database is ready. If database is ready, then we need some classes to interact with the database. Now, entity framework provides a database first approach. In database first approach, the classes are generated for you according to the database and tables. Earlier in code first, what happened? You designed the classes for which database and tables are created or mapped. But in the next scenario, you can see that database is already there, and for the existing database, the domain specific classes are created, so that you can start communicating with the database. Now, in the third situation, if you do not have the domain specific classes and you do not have the database ready, then what you can do is you can use a visual designer. Through visual designer, you can design the entity model, and when you design the entity model, for your model automatically it will generate the classes as well as database. That means we do not have domain classes and we do not have the database. We are doing everything through a visual designer, and that visual designer is responsible for generating the classes as well as the database. So, three types of modeling approaches, database programming approaches are there in entity framework. We have a code first approach, database first approach, and model first approach. So, what is exactly the database first approach? In database approach, you already have database and tables. Entity framework will generate the classes for that, so that you can start communicating with the database by using the classes. What happens in code first approach? You design the database related classes through a business requirement specification, and entity framework will generate the database and tables, or it will interact with the database and tables when they are ready. Here code is first, and in the previous situation database first. And the third situation is the model first approach. In model first approach, we will design the visual designer. The visual designer comprises of all the relationships in a diagrammatic form, and to this visual designer, entity framework will generate the classes as well as the database tables. We call this type of approach as model first approach. So, entity framework has three different modeling techniques. We have code first, we have database first, and model first. Practically we will see them how to use these three types of approaches in our later sessions. But what exactly entity framework comprises of? Let us take a look. That means whenever we are working with our traditional ADO.NET, you know that the basic ADO.NET architecture comprises of connection, command, data reader, data adapter, data set, and data view. But in ADO.NET entity framework architecture, what are the major components of entity framework architecture? See, entity framework, ADO.NET entity framework comprises of EDM. We call this as entity data model. EDM comprises of three main components: the conceptual model, storage model, and mapping. Conceptual model actually represents the data we are working with. So, in entity data model, there will be a conceptual model that represents the data we are working with, and storage model contains the data. That means the data is stored in the storage model and it is represented through the conceptual model. And mapping contains information that specify how a conceptual model will communicate with the storage model. So, in entity data model, the conceptual model needs to communicate with the storage model, and that is done by using mapping. Mapping contains information that specify how a conceptual model communicates with the storage model. So, entity data model has three important components: conceptual model, mapping, and storage model. Conceptual model represents the data, storage model contains the data, and mapping contains information that specify how a conceptual model will communicate with storage model. And in entity framework, we do not use SQL queries anymore. Entity framework uses link you to entity and entity SQL queries. Link you to entity, entity SQL are query approaches used in entity framework, but these queries are not understandable to database. So, we have to translate the link you queries into the database native queries. Remember one point, in entity framework we are not writing anything for database. That means we are going to eliminate most of the data access code we need to write earlier. So, that means here everything is queried by using link you. So, entity framework uses link you to entity and entity SQL as query approaches to communicate with database, but these query approaches are not understandable to the database. That means the link you queries must be translated into database native queries, that is done by entity client data provider. So, what is the role of entity client data provider in entity framework? It will translate the link you queries into the database native queries. As entity framework will use all link you queries, they are translated into database native queries by entity client data provider. And object services is the main entry point for entity framework. It is responsible for reading the data from the data source and return it back. So, what is object services in entity framework? It is the main entry point of entity framework. It is responsible for reading the data from the data source and return it back. So, entity framework comprises of an ADO.NET data provider, and we know the providers. Generally, we have SQL provider, ODBC provider, OLEDB provider. These will provide all the classes to communicate with the database. So, entity framework architecture comprises of EDM with conceptual model, storage model, mapping. Conceptual model represents the data, storage model contains the data, mapping contains information that specify how conceptual model communicates with storage model. In entity framework, the queries are link you to entity, entity SQL. These queries are translated into database native queries by using entity client data provider. And object services is the main entry point of entity framework, which is responsible for reading the data from data source and return it back. Overall communication in entity framework with the database is handled by using .NET data providers. This is the basic architecture of ADO.NET entity framework. Now, we will see practical approach and what are the libraries required to deal with entity framework, that we will continue in our later sessions of entity framework. Thank you, and keep watching Naresh IT Technologies YouTube channel and subscribe for more. Thank you.